The Curse of Dudleytown. The story behind one of the most infamous lost towns in American history. For many years, ghost hunters have been fascinated by tales of the lost village of Dudleytown, a vanished Connecticut village that was apparently plagued by ghosts, demons, and residents who vanished without a trace. These grave events were said to be caused by a curse, brought by the Dudley family to the New World. But how real was this curse? As the reader will soon find, this so-called curse was nothing more than the product of active imaginations, but as you will also discover, there was something very strange occurring in Dudleytown, whether cursed or not. In the far reaches of northwestern Connecticut, in the shadows of the mountains and lost in the pages of time, rests the remains of a small village called Dudleytown. The homes of this once thriving community are long gone, but the land where the town once stood is far from empty. Amidst the forest and rocks are tales of ghosts, demons, unexplained mysteries, curses, and a rich history that dates back to the very beginnings of America. Today, only the cellar holes and a few stone foundations remain. The roads that once traversed to this place are now little more than narrow trails where only a few adventurous hikers and the occasional ghost hunter dare to wander. Although it is forbidden, the most hardened curiosity seekers still dare to venture down dark entry road and into these shadowy woods at night. Dudleytown, or at least the area where it was located, was first owned by a man named Thomas Griffiths, one of the first to settle in this region, in the early 1740s. There are no records to say that he ever lived where Dudleytown later stood, but he did own half of the land in 1741. A few years later, with the arrival of Gideon Dudley in 1747, the village would be named. Gideon was followed to the region by two brothers, and Dudleys have become known over the years as the men who brought a curse to this small town, a curse that has allegedly plagued the region ever since. According to what have turned out to be both recent and fanciful accounts, the curse had its beginnings in England in 1510. At that time, Edmund Dudley was beheaded for being involved in a plot to overthrow King Henry VIII. Supposedly, a curse was placed on the family at this time, which stated that all of the Dudley descendants would be surrounded by horror and death. Proponents of the curse claim that the Dudleys then began to experience a rather disquieting run of bad luck. Edmund's son, John Dudley, also attempted to control the British throne by arranging for his son, Guilford, to marry Lady Jane Grey, next in line for the crown. After Edward VI died, Lady Jane became the queen for a short time before the plan failed, ending with the execution of Lady Jane and the two Dudleys. To make matters worse, Guilford's brother returned from France, and being a military officer, brought home a plague that he spread to his officers and troops. The sickness wiped out massive numbers of British soldiers and eventually spread throughout the country, killing thousands. John Dudley's third son, Robert, Earl of Leicester, a favorite of Elizabeth I, wisely decided to leave England and travel to the New World. It would be his somewhat luckier descendant, William, who would settle in Guilford, Connecticut. Three of William's descendants, Abiel, Barzillai, and Gideon, would later buy a plot of land in Cornwall Township. While there are undoubtedly some grim events that surrounded the Dudley family in England and France, questions have been raised as whether or not any curse really followed them to America. The question has been raised because in order for the curse to have been passed along to account for the haunting of Dudleytown, then William Dudley would have had to have been the son of Robert, Earl of Leicester, but he wasn't. Robert Dudley had only two sons, and one of them died while still a child. The other went to Italy, and while he had children, all of them remained in that country. This means that there was no link between William, his sons who founded Dudleytown, and any so-called curse. But while we may have established the fact that Dudleytown was never cursed, this does not mean that it was not tainted in some other way. There are many places across the country where odd things happen and where the land does not seem quite right. Records indicate that the land around Dudleytown was once Mohawk Indian tribal grounds, but tell us little else before the coming of the first settlers. This region has gained a chilling reputation over the years. Could the weird stories and strange disappearances here be connected to the past in some way, or are they nothing more than just coincidence and imagination? In the early 1740s, the mentioned Thomas Griffiths bought a parcel of land that would later be considered the first lot in Dudleytown. The land today looks much as it did when Griffiths first came here. It is covered in thick forest and the ground is strewn with rocks. The nearby mountains also heavily shadow the area, so it receives little sunlight. The woods were later dubbed with the rather ominous name of Dark Entry Forest. In 1747, Gideon Dudley bought some land from Griffiths to start a small farm. By 1753, Gideon's two brothers, Barzillai and Abiel Dudley, from Guilford, Connecticut, also purchased land nearby. A few years later, a Martin Dudley from Massachusetts also moved to the area but was from a different line of the family. He later married Gideon's daughter. One thing that should be mentioned was that Dudleytown was never an actual town. It was a more isolated part of Cornwall. The village rested in the middle of three large hills, which accounts for the recollections of it being nearly dark at noontime. The Cornwall township was never a good area for farming, as is apparent by the rocks that were used to build the foundations and stone walls that still stand today. In spite of this, though, settlers began to trickle into the area. The Tanner family, the Jones, the Pattersons, the Dibbles, and the Porters all took up residence here. The community grew even larger after iron ore was discovered nearby, and farming became a secondary concern. However, there were never any stores, shops, schools, or churches in Dudleytown. Provisions had to be purchased in nearby towns, and when one died, a trip to Cornwall was necessary because, in addition to there being no church in town, there was no cemetery either. The population of Dudleytown was never large, and according to an 1854 map, the peak number of families who lived here only reached 26. In spite of all of these things, the town did thrive for a time. Dudleytown was noted for its timber, which was burned and used to make wood coal for the nearby Litchfield County iron furnaces in Cornwall and other towns. The furnaces later moved closer to the railroads and the more industrial towns, though the lumber was no longer needed. Iron ore was used from the area for a time, and there were 3 water-powered mills in Dudleytown as well. Most of the mills eventually closed because of the long trip down the mountain to deliver their goods. Despite the outward signs of prosperity, though, there were strange deaths and bizarre occurrences at Dudleytown from the start. Some historians have attempted to downplay the unusual events in recent years. They will debunk the legends of the town by first stating how few people there ever were who lived here, and then will try and downplay the disappearances, cases of insanity, and weird deaths, as if such things happen all of the time. And perhaps they do, but why so many unusual happenings in such an isolated area with so few people living in it? The number of deaths that have occurred here would not be such a high number in a larger town, but in this small community, one can't help but wonder what exactly was taking place. There are also, I believe, an inordinate number of people who went insane in this area, as well as people who simply vanished that are in addition to those who are documented here. It's no wonder, bogus or not, that a story started about a Dudleytown curse. 3 of the Dudleys moved out of the region and lived long and full lives, dying of natural causes and forever diminishing any possibilities of a curse. Only Abiel Dudley remained in town, and after a series of reverses, lost his entire fortune and his mind. Abiel died in 1799 at the age of 90, and when he was no longer able to pay his debts, the town took his property, sold it, and then made him a ward of the town. Toward the end, Abiel was senile and insane and would not be the last to suffer from this affliction. In 1792, 7 years before Abiel Dudley passed away, his good friend and neighbor, Jershon Hollister, was killed while building a barn at the home of William Tanner, Abiel's closest neighbor. Tanner was also said to have gone insane, although likely from old age and senility, rather than from supernatural influences. He lived to the age of 104 and, according to records, was slightly demented at the time of his death. There have been stories that have circulated claiming that Tanner told other villages of strange creatures that came out of the woods at night. If this is true, there is no way for us to know if these creatures were products of the unexplained or products of Tanner's feeble mind. The Nathaniel Carter family moved to Dudleytown in 1759 and lived in a house once owned by Abiel Dudley before he was made a ward of the town. A mysterious plague swept through Dudleytown and Cornwall and took the lives of the Adoniram Carter family, relatives of Nathaniel, and saddened by the loss, they moved to Binghamton, New York from Dudleytown in 1763. Those who believe in the curse say that the taint of Dudleytown followed after them, but their tragic fate was actually far too common during the early days of the frontier. The Carters moved to the Delaware wilderness in the heart of Indian Territory, and during an attack, Indians slaughtered Nathaniel, his wife and an infant child. The Carters' other 3 children were abducted and taken to Canada, where 2 daughters were ransomed. The son, David Carter, remained with his captors, married an Indian girl, and later returned to the United States for his education. He went on to edit a newspaper and became a justice on the Supreme Court. Another bizarre tragedy affected one of the most famous residents of the region, General Herman Swift, who had served in the Revolutionary War under George Washington. In 1804, his wife Sarah Fay was struck by lightning while standing on the front porch of their home near Dudleytown. She was killed instantly. The general went insane and died soon after. Many have dismissed this incident as not being connected to the other unusual events, saying that Swift did not actually live in Dudleytown but on Bound Mountain Road, where his house remains today, and that he only went insane when he became old and senile. But in an area this sparsely populated, the records indicated 3 people to have gone insane in the space of less than a half-century. Could this be mere coincidence? And does a person being struck by lightning while standing on their front porch qualify as being unusual? I would say that it does, and our story is not yet complete. Another famous personage allegedly connected to Dudleytown was Horace Greeley, the editor and founder of the New York Tribune, or so the stories of the curse go. In this case, the story deserves to be debunked. Greeley married a young woman named Mary Young Cheney, who the stories of the curse say was born in Dudleytown. In truth, Mary was born and raised in nearby Litchfield and never lived in Dudleytown. She left the area as early as 1833 and went to live in a vegetarian boarding house that was owned by Dr. Graham, of Graham cracker fame, and became involved in the popular wellness movement of the time. While there, she met and later married Horace Greeley. In 1872, Greeley ran for president against Ulysses S. Grant and lost the election. A short time before it, Mary suffered from an attack of lung disease and died. Her death occurred in New York City with her husband and 2 daughters, Ida and Gabriel, in attendance. She was buried in Greenwood Cemetery. The legends claim that she committed suicide, but this was not the case. Greeley himself died 1 month later, and the electoral votes that he received in the election were distributed to minor candidates. After the Civil War, Dudleytown began to die, and many of the villagers simply packed up and moved away. The demise of the town itself is hardly surprising, whether you believe in the so-called curse or not. Its geographical location was foolhardy at best. Surrounded by hills and at elevations of more than 1,500 feet, there was little chance that a good crop would ever grow and sustain life in the village. The winters were harsh here, and even the hardy apple trees were stunted from months of cold. As mentioned already, the soil was rocky and the area was plagued by almost too much water. It pooled into tepid swamps and seeped into the earth, creating a damp morass. But even if you overlook the idea of an actual curse and admit that the location of the town must have had a hand in its undoing, the sheer number of unusual deaths, leaving out that of Mary Greeley, and mental conditions in such an isolated area more than suggests that something out of the ordinary was occurring in the little town. And no matter how hard the debunkers try to disregard the next mysterious event to occur in Dudleytown, their efforts fall short. This event occurred in 1901, at a time when the population of Dudleytown had dwindled away to almost nothing. One of the last residents of the town was a man named John Patrick Brophy. Tragedy visited swiftly and in several blows. First, his wife died of consumption, which was not uncommon in those days, and there was nothing strange about her ailment, as she had been suffering from it for years. This did not lessen Brophy's grief, however, but he was soon further stricken when his 2 children vanished into the forest just a short time after the funeral. And while their disappearance could have been voluntary, they had been accused of stealing sleigh blankets. A minor offense, there is nothing to indicate that it was. They vanished and were never found. Shortly after, the Brophy's house burned to the ground in an unexplained fire, and not long after, Brophy himself vanished into the forest. He was never seen again. By the early 1900s, Dudleytown was completely deserted. The remaining homes began to fall into disrepair and ruin, and soon the forest began to reclaim the village that had been carved out of it. But there was still one other death that proponents of the curse have connected to Dudleytown. And while the curse may be unlikely, it does mark one additional case of insanity for an isolated region that was already riddled with them. Around 1900, Dr. William Clark came to Cornwall and fell in love with the forest and the quiet country life. Clark had been born in 1877 and grew up on a farm in Tenafly, New Jersey. He later became a professor of surgery and taught at Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons, as well as earning a reputation as the leading cancer specialist in New York. He purchased 1,000 acres of land in the wilds of Connecticut, which included Dudleytown, and began construction of a summer and vacation home here. Over the next number of years, he and his wife, Harriet Bank Clark, visited the house on weekends and during the summer until it was completed. After that, it became mostly a holiday house for short trips in the summer and for Thanksgiving. Together, they maintained an idyllic second life near Dudleytown until 1918. One summer weekend, Dr. Clark was called away to New York on an emergency. His wife stayed behind, and according to the story, he returned 36 hours later to find that she had gone insane, just as a number of previous residents of the village had done. The story also claims that she told of strange creatures that came out of the forest and attacked her. She committed suicide soon after. But how much truth is there to this tale? Perhaps more than some would like you to believe. It has been recorded that for several years before her suicide, Mrs. Clark suffered from a chronic illness. There is nothing to indicate what this ailment might have been or whether it was a physical or mental one. I think that it is safe to say, though, that mentally stable individuals do not ordinarily take their own lives. As far as whether or not she saw strange creatures in the woods, well, we will never really know for sure, but even if we disregard this, we still have one more suicide that occurred to a resident of the nearly non-existent village of Dudleytown. While undoubtedly shattered by his wife's suicide, Dr. Clark continued to maintain his house in Dudleytown and continued to visit. A number of years later, he remarried and returned to stay at his summer house until a larger home was completed nearby in 1930. In 1924, he and his wife, Carita, as well as other doctors, friends and interested landowners, formed the Dark Entry Forest Association. It was designed to act as forest preserve so that the land around Dudleytown would remain forever wild. They held their first meeting in 1926 with 41 members. Dr. Clark died in Cornwall Bridge in February 1943, and Carita passed away 5 years later. A number of their children and family members still reside in the area. Today, Dudleytown is mostly deserted, except for the curiosity seekers and tourists who come looking for thrills. The Dark Forest Entry Association still owns most of the land the village once stood on. There are a group of homes on Bald Mountain Sun Road that are very secluded from the main roads, and they belong to the closest residents. These locals maintain that nothing supernatural takes place in this region, and perhaps they are right. It seems unlikely that the curse on Dudleytown ever really existed, but on the other hand, there is something strange about such a small area with so many disappearances, unusual deaths, suicides, and cases of insanity. The stories of a curse had to have gotten started for some reason, and perhaps this was why. As far as we know, the ghostly tales began to surface in the 1940s. It was at this time that visitors to the ruins of the village began to speak of strange incidents and wispy apparitions in the woods. Even today, those who have visited the place boast of paranormal photographs, overwhelming feelings of terror, mysterious lights, sights and sounds, and even of being touched, pushed and scratched by unseen hands. Some researchers refer to the area as a negative power spot, or a place where entities enter this world from the other side. They say this may explain the strange events in Dudleytown's history, like the eerie reports, the strange creatures, and perhaps even the outbreaks of insanity and madness. The place is often thought of as tainted in some way, as if the ground has somehow spoiled here, or perhaps was sour all along. Some historians and debunkers dismiss such reports and theories and maintain that just because the so-called curse of Dudleytown doesn't exist, then nothing strange has ever occurred here either. However, an open-minded look at some of the things that have happened do seem to show this is a strange place, and one that has been an enigma from the earliest days of its history. Whether or not there is any truth to the accounts of people who have come here since the days when the village was abandoned is up to the reader to decide. I should warn you, though, that trying to visit Dudleytown today can be hazardous, and not because of ghosts. It should be noted that the planners for the Dark Forest Entry Association have forbidden trespassing on their property. In 1999, they announced that they would no longer allow hikers on the land. In spite of this, many still go, now daring not only the spirits but the authorities as well. Unfortunately, the ruins of Dudleytown have been vandalized in recent years, and the constant streams of trespassers have had a negative effect on the ecology of the area. Just as unfortunate is the fact that the forbidden quality of Dudleytown is what brings so many curiosity seekers to the vicinity. However, this author advises readers to refrain from visiting this area until methods can be devised to better preserve the wilderness here, and until this unsettled corner of New England has been opened to the public again. Whispers of Ravenbrook. The sun was setting over the flat expanse of the Texas plains when Emma Harper's car began sputtering. She glanced at the fuel gauge. It hovered ominously above empty. "Not now," she muttered, knuckles whitening as she gripped the steering wheel. The road stretched ahead, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through a sea of tall grass, with no sign of civilization in sight, except for a worn wooden sign that read "Welcome to Ravenbrook." Curiosity tugged at her. Ravenbrook wasn't on any map she had seen while planning her cross-country drive from Los Angeles to New York. With no other options and the car's engine coughing its last breaths, Emma turned onto the gravel road leading into the town. As she drove, an uneasy feeling settled over her. The trees lining the road seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air grew thick, carrying the scent of damp earth, and something else she couldn't quite place a hint of decay mingled with the sweetness of wildflowers. Ravenbrook appeared as if trapped in time. Quaint wooden houses with peeling paint stood alongside cobblestone streets, and antique lampposts flickered to life as dusk surrendered to night. Emma parked near what looked like the town square, where a stone fountain stood dry and cracked, its centerpiece a statue of a woman cloaked and hooded gazing down with sightless eyes. She stepped out of the car, the sound of her boots echoing unnaturally in the stillness. There were no people, no cars, not even the distant bark of a dog, only the whispering wind weaving through the empty streets. "Hello?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the silence. A light flickered in a building labeled Ravenbrook Inn. Relieved, Emma grabbed her backpack and headed toward it. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit lobby filled with antique furniture and the musty scent of aged wood. An elderly man appeared behind the reception desk. His pale blue eyes met hers with a mix of surprise and was that fear. "Well, this is unexpected," he said softly. "We haven't had a visitor in quite some time." "My car broke down," Emma explained. "I was hoping to find a place to stay for the night and maybe someone who can help with repairs." He hesitated before responding. "I'm Samuel. We have rooms available, of course. Not much demand these days." He handed her an old-fashioned key attached to a heavy brass fob engraved with the number 7. "Rooms upstairs." "Thank you," she said, taking the key. "Is there a mechanic in town?" Samuel's gaze shifted momentarily. "I'm afraid not. Best to get some rest. Things always look better in the morning." As she climbed the winding staircase, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Samuel was hiding something. The hallway was lined with faded portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her. Unlocking the door to room 7, she stepped inside to find a quaint space adorned with vintage decor, a 4-poster bed draped with lace curtains, a vanity with a tarnished mirror, and a window overlooking the town square. She set her backpack down and pulled out her phone. No signal, of course. Sighing, she decided to explore the town, hoping to find someone who could help, or at least a place to grab a meal. Back on the street, night had fully descended, bringing with it a thick fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. Shadows danced at the edge of her vision, but when she turned to look, there was nothing there. "Hello?" she called out again, her voice muffled by the fog. Still no response. She wandered until she found herself outside a building marked Town Hall. The doors were unlocked. Inside, rows of empty chairs faced a podium, above which hung a large painting of the same cloaked woman from the fountain. Intrigued, Emma approached the painting. The woman's face was partially obscured by the hood, but her eyes, strikingly green, seemed almost real. "Beautiful, isn't she?" a voice whispered behind her. Emma spun around to see a young girl standing there, her dress tattered and feet bare. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you," the girl said, her eyes wide and innocent. "It's okay," Emma replied, her heart racing. I was just admiring the painting. Who is she? They call her the Lady of Ravenbrook, the girl said softly. She's the guardian of our town. Guardian? Emma echoed. Where's everyone? The town seems empty. The girl's expression darkened. They're hiding. From the shadows. A chill ran down Emma's spine. Hiding? What do you mean? Before the girl could answer, a distant bell tolled, its deep, resonant chime echoing through the night. The girl's eyes widened with fear. I have to go, she whispered urgently. You should too, before they find you. Wait, Emma called after her, but the girl had vanished into the fog. Unease blossomed into fear. Emma hurried back toward the inn, but the streets seemed to twist and turn, leading her astray. The fog thickened, and whispers drifted on the wind, indistinct voices murmuring words she couldn't understand. She stumbled upon the cemetery, a sprawling expanse of crooked tombstones and tangled weeds. An old mausoleum stood at its center, its iron gates ajar. Compelled by a mix of fear and curiosity, Emma approached it. Inside, the air was colder, and the whispers grew louder. Etched above the entrance were the words, "Beware the Watchers." She took a step back, but the ground shifted beneath her feet, and she fell, tumbling into an open grave. Pain shot through her ankle as she landed. Gritting her teeth, she tried to stand, but the injury made it impossible. The whispers grew into wails, and shadowy figures emerged around the edge of the grave, humanoid shapes with eyes glowing like embers. Help! Emma screamed, but her voice was lost in their haunting chorus. Suddenly, strong hands gripped her shoulders, pulling her up. She gasped and found herself face to face with Samuel. "We need to get you out of here," he said urgently. He half carried her back to the inn, the shadowy figures keeping their distance, but never disappearing entirely. Once inside, he bolted the doors and drew the curtains. "What is happening?" Emma demanded, her voice shaking. "What were those things?" Samuel sighed heavily. "They are the Watchers, the cursed souls bound to this town. Long ago, Ravenbrook made a pact with the Lady to protect us from a great plague. In return, we were to give her a sacrifice every harvest moon. But one year, the townsfolk refused, and the Lady cursed us all." "That's just a story," Emma protested weakly. He met her eyes. "You've seen them yourself. You know it's not just a story." "Why didn't you tell me to leave?" she whispered. "Because no one leaves Ravenbrook," he replied grimly. "Once you enter, the Watchers mark you." Despair washed over her. "There has to be a way." "There might be," Samuel said slowly. "The curse could be broken if someone confronts the Lady herself and appeals to her mercy." Emma squared her shoulders. "Then I'll find her." He shook his head. "It's too dangerous." "What other choice do I have?" Samuel studied her determined expression and finally nodded. "Very well. At dawn, the path to her lair reveals itself in the forest beyond the town. I'll show you the way." The night passed fitfully, with shadows scratching at the windows and disembodied voices echoing in the halls. When the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Emma and Samuel set out. They entered the forest, following a narrow trail that wound between ancient trees. The air was thick with mist, and the silence was profound, a world holding its breath. After what felt like hours, they reached a clearing where a small, dark lake mirrored the overcast sky. In the center stood a stone altar, and beyond it, a cave entrance shrouded in darkness. "This is as far as I go," Samuel said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emma nodded, fear and resolve warring within her. She stepped onto the narrow strip of land leading to the altar. As she approached, the waters began to ripple, and the Lady emerged, a figure draped in flowing robes, her face still hidden beneath the hood. "Why have you come?" The Lady's voice echoed, resonating within Emma's very bones. "To plead for mercy," Emma replied, her voice steady. "Release this town from its curse." The Lady tilted her head. "And what will you offer in return?" Emma hesitated. "What do you want?" "Your life," the Lady whispered. "A soul freely given can break the chains." Emma's heart pounded. "If I agree, the Watchers will be freed, the curse lifted." "Yes," the Lady replied, "but know this, sacrifice is binding. There is no turning back." Closing her eyes, Emma took a deep breath. Images flashed through her mind, her family, her dreams, the life she had yet to live. But she couldn't abandon the innocent souls trapped in Ravenbrook. "I accept," she said firmly. The lady raised her hands and tendrils of shadow enveloped Emma, cold seeping into her very core. Pain, unlike anything she'd ever known, surged through her, but she didn't scream. As the darkness consumed her, a blinding light burst forth, and the shadows recoiled. The lady let out a piercing cry, and then there was silence. When Emma opened her eyes, she was alone. The lake was calm, the altar cracked and crumbling. The oppressive weight that had hung over the forest was gone. She made her way back to the town, her steps lighter despite the lingering pain. Ravenbrook was transformed, the fog lifted, sunlight streaming down to illuminate the vibrant colors of the buildings. People filled the streets, their faces alight with joy and relief. Samuel approached her, tears in his eyes. "You did it," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "The curse is broken." A smile spread across Emma's face, but it was tinged with sadness. "I guess this is goodbye," she whispered. He nodded, understanding. "Your sacrifice won't be forgotten." As the townsfolk gathered to thank her, Emma felt herself fading, her form becoming insubstantial. She looked at her hands, now translucent, and felt a strange peace settle over her. Her final moments were filled with gratitude and a sense of purpose fulfilled. As her spirit drifted away, the whispers that once brought fear now carried a melody of hope, a new beginning for Ravenbrook. Days later, travelers passing through the area would find a lively town where none had existed on any map. And in the town square, a new statue stood beside the old fountain, a tribute to a brave soul who gave everything to break an ancient curse. Legend says that on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can hear her laughter mingling with the wind, a reminder that courage and selflessness can transcend even the darkest shadows. The haunting of Hollow Pines. They called it Hollow Pines, a small, isolated town hidden deep within the heart of Texas, so remote it wasn't even marked on most maps. Most people drove past the jagged dirt roads leading into Hollow Pines without a second thought, perhaps catching a glimpse of its sprawling fields and the ominous tree line that encircled the town like a cage. But no one knew why those who visited never returned. For decades, Hollow Pines had been a town that time forgot. Once a thriving settlement in the early 1900s, it had faded into obscurity after a series of inexplicable tragedies. The remaining residents whispered about the shadows, a name that described the ghostly figures that prowled the village, lingering at the edge of vision. To outsiders, it was merely a legend, but to the villagers it was a curse born from blood and bound to the very soil beneath their feet. The tale began with the Mercer family, one of the founding families of Hollow Pines. They were rumored to have dabbled in dark rituals to protect their land from settlers and thieves. A century later, their mansion still stood on the hill, casting a long, foreboding shadow over the town below. The townsfolk avoided it, especially at night when a strange, bluish light flickered from the windows, accompanied by the faint strains of distant chanting. One foggy autumn night, Jack Carter, a skeptical journalist from Austin, rolled into Hollow Pines, armed with nothing but a notepad and an old camera. He'd heard about the stories of hauntings and strange disappearances, but he was convinced they were just myths spun by superstitious locals. Determined to uncover the truth, he checked into the only inn in town, a creaky, crumbling building called the Lantern's Rest. As Jack settled into his room, he noticed something unusual. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like blood. Outside, shadows seemed to shift unnaturally beneath the streetlights, stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic. He shivered, brushing it off as an overactive imagination, and headed to the town's tavern to meet some locals and gather information. At the tavern, he met Abigail, a weary old woman with sunken eyes and a voice as raspy as dry leaves. She was one of the few who dared to speak of the horrors that lurked in Hollow Pines. "They come every night," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "The shadows. They drift between the trees, watching us. They're waiting for something, for someone to free them." "Free them?" Jack asked, leaning in closer. Abigail nodded. "They're cursed souls, bound here for eternity because of what happened 100 years ago. The Mercers, they sacrificed innocent lives to protect their fortune. It stained the land. Now, anyone who stays too long in Hollow Pines is marked." Jack scoffed, though the chill creeping down his spine was unmistakable. He had never been one for ghost stories, but Abigail's words gnawed at him. Ignoring her warnings, Jack decided to explore the old Mercer mansion that night, armed with a flashlight and his trusty camera. The mansion loomed above him, silent and foreboding, its windows dark like eyes staring back into his soul. He pushed open the door, which creaked on rusted hinges, and was greeted by the musty smell of decay. Inside, the air felt colder, and an eerie silence enveloped him. His footsteps echoed against the walls, which were adorned with faded portraits of the Mercer family, grim faces frozen in time. He felt as though they were watching him, judging him. But he pressed on, climbing the staircase toward the attic where the rituals were said to have taken place. The attic was dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through a cracked window. Strange symbols were scrawled across the floor in faded red paint, forming a circle around a small, darkened altar. His pulse quickened as he approached, noticing a thick layer of dust covering everything except the altar. It looked as if someone or something had recently been there. Suddenly, Jack felt a presence behind him. He spun around, but the room was empty. Then, in the corner of his eye, he saw a shadow move, darting from one corner of the room to the other. His breath caught as the temperature plummeted, his exhaled breath visible in the freezing air. The shadows were here. Without warning, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the mansion, reverberating off the walls and filling him with sheer terror. He bolted for the staircase, but halfway down, he saw them, figures cloaked in darkness, their hollow eyes gleaming with a spectral glow. They reached for him, their hands gnarled and skeletal, whispers of ancient curses filling the air. Jack ran, heart pounding, stumbling down the stairs and out into the night. As he sprinted toward town, he realized the shadows were everywhere, drifting from tree to tree, their ghastly forms barely visible in the fog. He reached the lantern's rest, slamming the door behind him, but he knew it was no use. They had marked him. The rest of the night was a blur. He remembered flashes of those ghastly faces at his window, faint whispers scratching at his mind, beckoning him to join them in the darkness. By dawn, he was a shell of himself, pale and trembling, barely able to comprehend the horrors he had witnessed. The next morning, he packed his belongings and left Hollow Pines, vowing never to return. But as he drove away, he noticed something strange. In his rearview mirror, the fog lifted, revealing the townsfolk standing on the edge of the road, watching him with hollow eyes. Some were familiar faces he had seen in photographs, in old portraits, faces from the past. Jack's journey out of Hollow Pines was his last. Days later, his car was found abandoned on the outskirts of Austin, empty and cold. His camera lay on the passenger seat, filled with blurry, distorted images of dark figures reaching toward the lens. Jack Carter had vanished, like so many before him, becoming just another ghostly tale woven into the twisted history of Hollow Pines. To this day, those who venture into Hollow Pines are warned to turn back. The shadows wait patiently, lurking in the fog, waiting for another soul to add to their haunting collection. And if you ever find yourself on that lonely Texas road with Hollow Pines just ahead, remember, some stories are better left untold. The Whispering Oaks of Blackwood. In the far reaches of Louisiana lies Blackwood, a village cloaked in shadows and secrets, abandoned for nearly a century. Locals say the town is cursed and few dare venture near its borders. They whisper tales of spirits lost in the misty woods, of ghostly children playing on deserted streets, and a haunting melody that drifts through the night air. No one knows how the music began or who, if anyone, is still there to play it. The story of Blackwood begins with a woman named Eliza Harrow, known by the townsfolk as the Witch of Blackwood. Eliza arrived in the village in 1919, a year marked by famine and disease. With her raven hair and piercing green eyes, she was a mysterious presence. Despite the townspeople's initial suspicion, she quickly gained their trust, healing their wounds and curing their ailments with ancient remedies that worked wonders. But there was a price, a dark price, they would soon discover, that cost them dearly. One autumn evening, Eliza vanished. Her house was found empty, her belongings scattered, and her spellbook opened to a strange page with symbols no one recognized. Only her cat remained, howling in agony in an eerie silence that blanketed the town. The following morning, people began to disappear one by one. A child would leave to pick flowers by the river and never return. A farmer's wife would step outside to gather laundry, only to vanish without a trace. The entire village fell under a spell of dread, as the people realized the once helpful healer may have left a curse instead of a blessing. 50 years later, in 1969, a group of college students, drawn by tales of Blackwood's haunted history, decided to investigate. Among them was Rebecca, a history major with a fascination for all things supernatural. She had heard stories of the abandoned village but was skeptical, thinking it was just an elaborate myth to scare children. The group arrived in Blackwood on a fog-laden evening. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the sun had just begun to sink below the horizon. The town was quiet, too quiet. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine as they walked down the main street, lined with decaying houses and overgrown gardens. Shadows danced in the windows, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. As they explored the empty town, they found strange markings on the walls, symbols similar to those in Eliza's spellbook. Rebecca traced her fingers over one, feeling a faint warmth emanate from it. It felt like a heartbeat, slow and steady, pulsing beneath her touch. The night grew darker, and a thick fog rolled in, covering the village like a ghostly shroud. Just then, a haunting melody filled the air, a soft, mournful tune that seemed to drift from the forest surrounding Blackwood. It was the sound of a violin, sorrowful and ancient, as if mourning the souls lost to the village's curse. The students exchanged nervous glances, their bravado fading as the reality of Blackwood's darkness set in. Rebecca urged them to follow the sound, despite the protests of her friends. She felt an inexplicable pull, a strange connection to the music that she couldn't shake. They made their way through the twisted oaks at the edge of the village, their footsteps muffled by the dense fog. As they walked deeper into the woods, the music grew louder, more desperate, echoing through the trees like the whispers of lost souls. Then they sought the ruins of Eliza Harrow's house, shrouded in mist. The house had decayed over the years, but its eerie essence remained. The group hesitated, but Rebecca pushed forward, drawn by an invisible force. Inside, they found remnants of Eliza's life-rusted cauldrons, dusty herbs, and a large, faded book lying open on a wooden table. Rebecca approached it, feeling a strange sense of familiarity as she turned the brittle pages. She reached the final page, where a single word was scrawled in blood-red ink: return. Just then, the violin music stopped. A chilling silence filled the air, and a deep, raspy whisper echoed through the room. "You've come," it said, the words slithering into their ears like cold tendrils. Rebecca turned to see a figure standing in the doorway, a woman with raven hair and piercing green eyes. Eliza Harrow. Her friends screamed, backing away, but Rebecca was rooted to the spot, unable to look away from Eliza's gaze. Eliza's eyes bore into her, as if seeing through her very soul. "You are the one," Eliza murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "The one to break the curse or be bound by it forever." Rebecca felt an overwhelming sense of dread as Eliza stepped closer, her cold, translucent hand reaching toward her. She could feel a cold pressure on her chest, as if Eliza was pulling the very life out of her. Desperate, Rebecca stumbled backward, breaking free from Eliza's grip. Her friends grabbed her, pulling her out of the house, running as fast as they could through the fog. But the village wasn't done with them. As they ran, the mist thickened, twisting around them, making it impossible to see. They heard voices, hundreds of them whispering, calling their names, laughing in twisted glee. Shadows darted through the fog, flickering at the edge of their vision. They stumbled over roots and rocks, struggling to escape the relentless grip of Blackwood. Rebecca looked back and saw the villagers, the lost souls of Blackwood, their hollow eyes glowing in the dark, their hands reaching out to drag her back. She ran faster, her lungs burning, but the whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the entire town were alive, desperate to claim them. Finally, they broke through the mist, collapsing onto the dirt road outside of Blackwood. They looked back, expecting to see the shadows, the faces of the dead, but the town had vanished. Only the distant melody of the violin remained, echoing faintly in the distance, a reminder of the curse that lingered in the haunted woods. Years later, Rebecca returned alone. She was older now, and the horrors of Blackwood had left scars that had never healed. She needed answers. She needed to know why Eliza had chosen her, why the village had let her go. She entered the woods once more, following the same haunting melody. The village appeared through the fog, just as it had all those years ago. She made her way to Eliza's house, where the ghostly figure awaited her, a knowing smile on her face. This time, Rebecca wasn't afraid. Eliza spoke of the curse, of the souls bound to Blackwood, waiting for someone with the courage to free them. Rebecca realized the truth. She was the one destined to end the suffering, to break the spell that held the village captive. With a final whisper, Eliza handed her the ancient book, the words glowing faintly on the page. Rebecca read aloud, the air crackling with energy as the symbols began to fade, the curse lifting from the village like a dark cloud dispersing. As the final word left her lips, the figures of the lost villagers appeared around her, their faces peaceful for the first time in a century. They smiled, a look of gratitude in their eyes, before vanishing into the light. Rebecca left Blackwood for the last time, her heart heavy yet somehow lighter. She had freed the souls trapped within, ending the curse of the village. But as she walked away, she heard the faintest echo of a violin, a reminder that some stories never truly end.